Hello and welcome to yet another edition of Life and Times. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Gestin, all the way from Uganda, Kampala. That's where we are as we speak. And we come again with another insightful topic. This time around, it's a bit different, a topic that concerns the entire East Africa or even Africa as a continent. And on that note, I'll start this show with I'll try and do different greetings in different languages because that's what our topic is all about. I'm not very certain how many I can check, but I'll try and do what I can. So first off, it's how are you? That's English. Oriocha, that's Luganda. I know of Uraho, that's Randiz. Habari. If I didn't say that, Laura would probably jump off the call. But those are different. Those are different languages across East Africa, and that's where our discussion is going to be rotating. First things first, Laura. How are you doing? How many languages can you throw at me?
Yeah, that's a very tricky question. They say never tempt an African with that question. Most of us speak 3 to 4 languages, but myself, I only speak three.
Okay.
Uh, yeah, I don't know what is the greeting in Luganda though.
Did you say in Uganda?
Yes.
I'll go by the central, where the capital city lies. So that's Luganda. That's Odiotia. More like, how are you doing?
Ah, okay. In Kenya, we say habari, you got it. So yeah.
Yeah, but that's why our discussion is going to, rotate this evening. So different languages, and it is also said that when you look at the entire world, there is over 7,000 or even more so languages spoken. And this poses a challenge that we all know about. It's going to be difficult when you go to places. One of the things we worry about is how do I communicate? So let's start there. How hard is this, or how big of a problem is this language issue across not just East Africa? We can even zero it down to just Uganda or just Kenya. How big of a problem is this?
Well, it can be a bit of a challenge because communicating, I mean, language is the basis of communication. We have all forms, there can be nonverbal cues because we also live amongst people who are unable to speak for one reason or another. So language is almost like a universal tool. The only thing that we would say is different are just the words that we use that could be different. So it is definitely a challenge when you go into a room, for example, and you cannot understand a word that people are talking about. In Kenya, there could be that challenge, but you will not find it in the urban centers. It's only if you moved into the rural areas and you meet people who, for some reason, maybe have not been able to access education, so they can only speak their vernacular language. They're not able to speak in the official language, which is English, but then they would have some degree of the national language, which is Swahili, but then some will not fully understand that. So it is not a major problem that you would meet, especially in the urban centers. But then once you move into the rural parts of Kenya, and I'm sure the same case happens in Uganda, you would find people that only know how to communicate in their vernacular language fluently.
And in a world where there is lots of intermarriages, back in Uganda, a Muchiga will get married to a Muganda, and a Muganda will marry a Northerner or an Agul or something. So for families like that, what do you advise? Which language do they use, for example, in this case?
I mean, yeah, it's up to the families to decide. We have seen families in different places that are blended. So you find a child is able to speak the language of both the mother and both the father. But then it's also interesting because when you talk about intermarriage, this is one of the things that actually led to the birth of certain languages. Because if you look at Swahili, for example, it was intermarriage between the Bantu and the
Yeah.
Arabs that gave birth to Swahili. So the thing about language is that it is very dynamic. So when we think of it on that small scale of a family, for example, that's easy. I mean, the children get to choose which language they would want to speak. But then when you find a family that's really strict, they would oftentimes stick to English in most families. very few would be speaking Luganda, for example, for your case, people who are from the central part, very few of them would want to speak Luganda. You know, it's always better when you come from a blended family and you just want to speak English. You always seem, you know, of a different, of some kind of status. So it's up to every family to decide really what language they want to speak. But if it were up to me, and my advice would be teach your child the two languages, you know, for both communities so that they're able to converse. If you go to your mom's place, you can speak to people. You go to your father's place, you can speak to people. When you come to town, you also have the other language. I mean, we have the capacity to speak more than three languages fluently, so it should not be a problem, really.
Yeah, and you know, we talk about very many families opting for English in this case, but
Mhm.
where does this leave our native languages?
Yeah, I mean it's a very tricky balance because there's always been also that argument that culture is slowly dying because of Gen Zs and the younger generation coming up, that
Mm,
people do not want to be identified by their cultural identities, you know, and you would understand because there has been a lot of systemic injustices, especially in Africa, where it has been targeted on communities. So you would understand why someone would want to shed off that kind of tag. But then in the process of it, the danger is we're losing our culture because language is a big identifier of any culture whatsoever. You know, so it's something that we really need to be careful about. Where we need to decide where do we draw the line that we say we can speak in English, which everybody can understand, and then we can also speak our own, you know, vernacular languages, you know,
mm,
tie ourselves to our cultures, but then just self-censor ourselves to understand that no, we cannot go past this line, and I'm not going to discriminate you because you speak Luganda. Do not discriminate me because I speak Dholuo or you speak Chiga. Or, yeah, you know
mm.
those. Yeah, cultural languages. We still need. There's a very big need for us to still preserve those languages so that they don't die out in the next 20, 30 years.
And I'm glad you mentioned Ruchiga because guess who is a Mchiga here? But when you talk about the things that are attached to these cultures, I'll give you an example of my own culture, Bachiga.
Mhm.
When someone gets to know you're a Mchiga, the first thing they say about Bachiga is we are rude. Yeah. So very understandable when you talk about how people don't want to relate with their cultures and languages. But when we talk about how difficult it is for a family to decide if the kids are going to take, you know, either parent's language, then Laura, we have a bigger picture. We're talking about the East African community, for example. So if it's tricky for a family that has two parents, then as the East African community, where do we even start a discussion to have a single language?
I mean, I've always had this this discussion with my friends from Uganda, and Uganda, we are waiting for you to jump on the boat because Swahili is a language that is spoken in Kenya. It is in Tanzania. You know, parts of Rwanda speak Swahili. DRC speaks Swahili. So we're always looking onto the Ugandans like, oh, you're missing out. Like the boat is sailing, just jump in. You know. I know there are few Ugandans, not few actually. I think I know quite a number who also speak Swahili, so I think it's a very dicey language, you know. And I think your president, His Excellency Kaguta Museveni, also speaks Swahili. So
A lot
it's when it
bit.
comes to EAC, yeah, when it comes to EAC, it's quite that discussion that there have been discussions, by the way, to adapt Swahili as the language that is. And I'm seeing even South Africa, they are trying to jump on the bandwagon.
Mm.
So we are really waiting and hoping that the Republic of Uganda will see the light and join the rest of us so that we have a universal language. You know, it would be nice when, for example, Justin, you came to Kenya and you're able to communicate with anybody like it's just normal. You know, I don't have to worry about speaking, you know, you don't have to worry about speaking English and people say, that's Ugandan, you know, that even sell you things at an exorbitant
Yeah,
price.
yeah.
So I mean, looking at West Africa, we just say, let's go with the majority. The majority already speaking Swahili. Let us adopt that because you also do not want to adopt English. It's foreign to all of us, in as much as most countries use it as the official language. But then when it comes to our own identity as EAC,
Mm,
we need to come with
mm,
common ground.
mm.
If you ask me, let's go with what the majority already have. It's easier that way.
Aside, you know, glad you answered. But what should have been my next question of what do we go by to choose a language and say this is what we should take on? You
Mhm,
mentioned, you know, a language that is already being used by the majority. But
mhm.
I'll ask and say, how easy is it, you know, to convince someone from Rwanda to just say, you know what, Kiswahili is the language being used by the majority, so it's the language we should just take up. how easy is this battle going to be to convince all these other countries and all these other, cultures to officially or gladly get to a point where they say, you know what, we have accepted, let's take up this language. Because, the different people in Uganda are going to be saying, we don't understand the majority point. So Bachiga might come and say, maybe we are the minority, but look.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it is. It can be a diplomatic issue at the end of the day because everybody would want their own language, to become the official language of the region. Obviously, there would be that debate. But then we're looking at already people are speaking because I'm trying to look at the languages that are spoken across the entire member states of the EAC.
Okay.
And yes, yes. For if it's Uganda, how many tribes do you have in Uganda, for example?
Quite a number, should be over 78.
Yeah, we see those are so many.
So
So
many.
then we come to Kenya, yeah, there are about 47.
Mm.
You go to okay, Rwanda is just one. So you come to Tanzania, they also have their own sub-tribes and everything like that. So once we look at what is everybody from each country, what do we have in common?
Mm.
And Swahili cuts across. It's because also when you look at the migration and when people are moving across the continent, Bantu settled everywhere. So you see, Swahili would be a language that would be easier for a lot more people to understand because if you look, it borrows heavily from the Bantu, the phonetics and everything. So it would, of course, it would take time. It's not something that would happen overnight,
Yeah.
and it would take a lot of discussions. But then if we look at the structure of a language, for example, if you come to me as a Kenyan and you try to introduce me into a language like Dutch, for example, the intonation and the spelling is going to be very hard for my tongue to roll like that and say what the pronounce the words correctly. But if I come to, for example, Luganda, the tribe, because it's Bantu, the Swahili, it would be very easy for them to learn Swahili. They'd grasp it faster as opposed to the other tribes from the side of the lake. I know they would have a problem with that,
Yeah.
but then we're looking at, let us talk, we agree to disagree, but then I think it's also time, and I think this is a very interesting discussion because as a region we need to have our own identity. Look at
Mm.
the European Union, they speak English, and it's what they carry as the regional language. So what
Yeah.
is stopping us from EAC also from adapting one? Okay, maybe even if not Swahili, then because now I'm biased on my own, let us decide then that we'll speak Luganda, all of us.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And when you talk about, for example, the European Union, now they speak one language, so it's even tricky. You even sound funny to yourself if you're
Mhm.
starting to differentiate them. Yeah, because then there's going to
Exactly.
be a voice in your head saying, "Why are you doing this? They are
Exactly.
one people." Yeah, so I can fully
Mhm.
understand what it would be like if I'm speaking Swahili. So then you don't have to really say this is Uganda and this is Kenyan. Really makes a lot of sense. But
Yeah.
let's also talk about how much this would go in terms of fighting off the tribalism walls, saying Kenyan, Tanzanian and Ugandan, because when you're talking about being one people, in terms of trade and breaking the barriers on the borders and all that, it's really important that we're speaking the same language. That way, even someone who wants to really build up the tribalism walls struggles to figure out who is Kenyan, who is Ugandan. So then you don't know where to, take your wall.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we're stronger together. So once we develop one language, now we become
Mm.
like a block. So you see, it becomes like one big country. So like you see, if anybody wants to come and interfere with Uganda, the whole block can rise up and say, "Oh no, please, we are not accepting that," and it would be very hard for them, because we are speaking one language, one voice. It's just something that is a long time coming, and we should be adapting it like yesterday.
Okay, okay. There you have it. Thank you, Laura, for making the time once again, and for all of you that are watching this episode of Life and Times. We're discussing the question of language and the possibility of East Africa having one block language or one East African language that we can use to fight, the fight of the tribalistic wars and be one people. Like Laura says, it's very important to be one group of people that is together. That way we can go so far. Thank you also for making the time, and we'll catch you again in the next episode.